What's up everyone, Alex here. So a few days ago, I talked about how Square Enix basically took a $140 million loss because they canceled a bunch of games that they feel don't fit the strategy that they're going to try to employ in the future. And in this video, I want to talk about that specific strategy. And the funny thing about this is that I didn't expect to wake up to this article this morning, but thanks to the Subtle Doctor, who is our fantastic mod on our Discord, he shared this article this morning, probably expecting that I talk about it, and so here we are talking about it. Now, first and foremost, I want to be clear that I love video games and I love the fun in video games, but I think it's also interesting to look at these financial statements, not because we're investors or anything like that, but also it shows a kind of strategy that these companies might be employing to kind of hint at what's to come in the future. We can definitely glean a lot of that information here, and I'm less of a numbers guy, even though I have investments in some stocks and do options trading sometimes. But anyways, that's why I find this very fascinating, so let's just get right down into it. Square Enix's digital entertainment sales were ever so slightly up, mainly thanks to its HD games subsegment, the firm said. The solid performances of Final Fantasy XVI, Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster, Dragon Quest Monsters: The Dark Prince, and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth saw HD game sales increase to $636 million versus $503 million the previous fiscal year. Now, we can actually glean two things from that paragraph. First and foremost is the definition of HD games. A few months ago, when somebody was talking about HD games, they hinted at the fact that what Square Enix is actually describing are just the AAA games like Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. But seeing that paragraph, it's very clear that their definition of HD games encompass basically anything that's released on console or PC, which is of course Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster and Dragon Quest Monsters: The Dark Prince as examples. So if you encounter a YouTube video or a news article on a website talking about that HD games is only for like the highest budget titles that Square Enix has, now you know that when Square Enix talks about HD games, it's literally anything released on console and PC. The second part of that, of course, is the obvious, which is they actually made money. This HD game segment made money compared to the previous fiscal year. Now, if we look at that previous fiscal year, there were a lot of games that came out. We're talking Tactics Ogre Reborn, Harvestella, Valkyrie Elysium, Star Ocean: The Divine Force, the Live Alive remake, and before you say Triangle Strategy, that actually came out the prior fiscal year, which basically ended March 2023. However, the firm's MMO and games for smart devices, mobile, PC browser subsegments both declined year on year, 11% and 10% respectively, with the latter in particular seeing new releases underperforming and unable to compensate for weak performances from Square's back catalog. Now, what that's telling me is that consumer confidence for mobile games and spending in Square Enix mobile games is lessening over time. Now, we know what that is. Square Enix is notorious for just basically like ending service for games like in about 2 or 3 years. And knowing that these games aren't going to last long, I think a lot of consumers, especially in Japan, I'm talking specifically about Japan because they're really big into mobile gaming compared to us, they're not feeling too confident to spend more money in Square Enix games, which is bad for them. So they need to really work on that and think about that. In terms of MMOs, this is cyclical. So every 2 years or so, there's going to be a new expansion. This year is an expansion year for Final Fantasy XIV with Dawn Trail. And so every year after that becomes kind of like an off year where, you know, a lot of subscriber numbers kind of drop and dwindle. And then a lot of people resubscribe once the new expansion comes out. That's just the way that it is. And of course, being that like Final Fantasy XIV is the more actively reported of the three, and of course Dragon Quest X is also actively reported, but of course Final Fantasy XI hasn't had really a new expansion announced because technically the development is over. You know, basically that MMO department is literally just Final Fantasy XIV at this point, and partly Dragon Quest X. I'll give them credit for that. So I'm not going to read this paragraph right here because it's just basically saying that even though HD Games sold $636 million worth of sales, it's still not enough to meet their goal. But also they wanted to make it clear that this also takes into account the $140 million loss that they took by canceling all those games. So we've gone through all the numbers. What does that actually mean for Square Enix? Square Enix is still in a pretty good spot, right? Like their HD game segments are still selling, not as much as they'd hope, but they're still selling. And what's also very important about that is that while Square Enix refuses to talk about individual sales of their games, what it boils down to is that at the earnings call in these fiscal statements, if that whole division makes money, that's good for them. So them, they see it as a success, but they need a lot of streamlining. So this is what they have to say about that. The company's previous strategy included a target to rebuild its portfolio across both the HD games and smart devices segments, streamline said portfolios, and expand its MMO business. However, it said its journey to quote-unquote better profitability in HD game development has been quote-unquote incomplete, adding, "We launched many titles, but some failed to live up to profit expectations." And get this, especially outsourced titles and some AAA titles. AAA titles, we can probably make the assumption that it's Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Final Fantasy XVI. That's probably it, right? But also, the outsourced titles is very interesting because when you look back at not the previous fiscal year, but the one before that, there were a lot of Square Enix games that were actually launched that were not developed internally by Square Enix. Now, Team Asano has been employing outside developers for a long time, but it also stands to reason that it's because of Team Asano themselves that they're able to actually ensure the quality of those games that came out. Now, by Team Asano, of course, we're talking about Live Alive, and we're talking about both Octopath Travelers, Bravely Default, and of course, Triangle Strategy. If you take a look at that fiscal year ending 2023, March 2023, when Tactics Ogre Reborn came out, we also got Valkyrie Elysium, which was outsourced to an outside company, and that's not a game that, us fans of Valkyrie Profile were expecting. And Harvestella, as much as I like that game, it just didn't feel like it was up to the quality of a Square Enix title, and that really kind of bothered me tremendously. And this is especially important because Square Enix games are held to a certain standard, right? When you look at something like Dungeon Encounters, for example, you would never think that that's a Square Enix title ever, just even by looking at it. And so that's really something to keep in mind when they're talking about outsourced titles, is who has Square Enix actually hired outside of their company to make their games, because most of their games are usually made internally. Now, it also noted that a slowdown in SD games, which by the way, they're not talking about standard definition games. SD actually stands for smart devices, so we're talking mobile phones. Gaps in its management infrastructure, and cannibalization of our new titles due to the launch schedules overlap. Now, think about that for a second. Launch schedule overlap. If we go back to that fiscal year ending March 2023 again, it's not the last fiscal year, it's the previous fiscal year before that. There were a lot of overlaps in games, right? If I remember correctly, Diofield Chronicle and Valkyrie Elysium came out within 2 weeks of each other, which is not great. So this strategy is basically informed by the previous fiscal year and also the fiscal year before prior. Its new strategy to tackle these challenges is called Square Enix Reboots and Awakens, and it is a 3-year plan targeting long-term growth. The company wants to enhance its productivity and release titles more regularly by optimizing its development footprint, meaning no overlaps and making sure that games are actually hitting specific milestones. That's why we got that $140 million loss, is because certain games just aren't far along in development and they're just costing more money to try to get back on track. You don't throw money on things to get back on track. Hopefully you get to a point where it's a good spot and then you continue. That will involve revamping its organization and retiring its business unit-based organizational design. That basically means no more CBUs. That is insane. Now, the thing that really sucks about this is that they never really outlined what the organizational structure is going to be. But if we take the news of Yoshi P Asano-san and those other people's promotion to higher executive roles, they're actually working right now to figure out what that structure is. And if you look at this graph, they're basically wanting Square Enix to become leaner. And that's something that we talked about before when they canceled all of those games. They want to be leaner so that they can be more profitable. Because again, you don't want to throw money at the problem like what they did back in 2022 and just hope that people buy their games. That doesn't work. People have to be interested in their games. And so they're basically tapering down a lot of their, development expenses, being choosy when it comes to like what games they develop, which is of course reinforced by that previous news that I talked about, and being smart about where they spend their money. So just to kind of go over what this graph says, for the HD Games Development Division, they want to establish a development footprint capable of consistently and regularly releasing titles that meet customers' expectations. Remember when he talked about Valkyrie Elysium and talking about like Diofield Chronicle? People did not expect that. So they're going to be more mindful and listening to what we want as gamers. Maybe the return of some favorite titles like Final Fantasy Tactics, or heck, Vagrant Story, please. Like, we need a remake of that or a remaster of that, right? For the smart devices segment, resume growth trajectory by launching titles that enable disruptive growth. Now, I have to see how that actually works out, because obviously the mobile division is not doing too great. They basically keep killing off games, and so we'll see like if they can earn consumer like confidence on that. MMO, publication, and amusement. So that's three segments that are actually lumped together. That's interesting because in a way, MMOs and amusements are kind of tied together because they're kind of experiences that are very similar, right? When I think of going to Disneyland, for example, which is amusement, it's kind of like stepping into a fake virtual world, right? Like everything there is kind of like fantastical and fake. People kind of treat you very differently in that world. And MMOs are kind of similarly in that way, but very virtual. So lumping them together is very interesting. Something that people need to also remember is that they're also a publication business in terms of manga. So, books like Kakegurui, for example, that's like a Square Enix published manga right there. It says here that they want to maintain momentum, develop and expand global fan bases. So that means we're probably going to see a lot more mangas from Square Enix arrive in the West, which is really fantastic. And of course, like hopefully, because they want to expand their global fan base, maybe Dragon Quest X will finally arrive in the West, right? Like that is the one MMO that Square Enix is still running that they still haven't brought to the West. And I'm pretty sure there's a decent enough number of people here that would want to play that game. Merchandising. Their merchandise is super expensive. We all know that. They want to grow by creating additional business opportunities, basically meaning like they're going to try to see like what kind of different products they can make, maybe make it a little bit more accessible to people or things that people just generally care about more. But the bottom line, of course, is they want to become leaner. They don't want to overspend their money to make things and stuff. Because as I said, they're a content creation company. So the big thing for them is they want to spend their money wisely. It also intends to step up digital sales in order to diversify its earnings opportunities and further develop its IP across multiple media and markets. Multiple media, are you talking about like TV, movies, that sort of thing? Are you going to follow Nintendo's, example and stuff and kind of follow that route, or have TV shows? That's very interesting to me, and I don't necessarily think that they're going to go that route, but multiple media kind of implies that. Maybe the return of CG movies, for example. Who knows? I think at this point right now, like the best thing for Square Enix to do is to really streamline their HD game segment. As far as the SD game segment goes, I feel like they need to just kind of sustain and maybe design experiences that last a lot longer as opposed to releasing a lot more frequently. MMOs, we have Dawn Trail coming, so I don't think that's going to be a problem for them, but I'm really curious about what this organizational structure is going to be, because this is the first time Square Enix has been kind of like mum about that sort of thing. They're usually very public about that over the past 2 decades and stuff. So I'm hoping that we hear about that like in the near future in like a quarterly earnings call. But I've talked a lot about this, and I want to hear what you think about what's going on right now. And if you have any questions about like any sort of the things that they've revealed here. Once again, there's been a lot of really good defining of things here, like of course what HD games is and what SD games is. And of course, I'm curious what you would like Square Enix to make, just to make this all about games again. Post your thoughts in the comments below and let's talk about it. Thank you very much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.